And I'm one of the patent consultants here supporting the conference, and I just have a few announcements before I present our speaker. Please make note that tomorrow at 2:45 in room 108, the Children's Institute play will take place so that you can go. There was an error in the keynote. I can't remember what the error was about. I think it was about the time. So make sure you make note of the new time. It's 2:45 in room 108. The exhibit hall is open today until 6 p.m. and we also have the poster session going on in President's Hall, or Dean's Hall, I'm sorry, with a cash bar from 4:30 to 6:30, so we hope that you all plan to attend. We have quite a few posters, some international submissions, so please attend that. At the end of the session, you all know the drill, I'll be telling you the code. And so, without any more delay, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Timothy Vollmer. He received his PhD in psychology from the University of Florida in 1992. Should I say the years? There was an emphasis in that program in behavior analysis. He served as a member of the psychology faculty at Louisiana State University, the medical school faculty at the University of Pennsylvania from 1996 to 98, and then returned to the University of Florida in 1998. And he is currently a professor of psychology at the University of Florida. He's the editor-elect for the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and at the University of Florida, he directs the Behavior Analysis Research Clinic and teaches undergrad and grad courses. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vollmer.
Thank you for attending this morning. Can everybody hear me okay with this mic? Raise your hand and you got it? Okay. The topic I was asked to present on today is antecedent interventions, and in trying to think through what I might talk about specifically in a 3-hour session, I was kind of torn because antecedent interventions, as some of you may know, is really kind of a broad topic area, and it's something that one could conceivably teach an entire semester on antecedent interventions. So what I kind of decided to do is focus on one branch of antecedent interventions that I have been particularly involved in terms of the historical development of this intervention procedure known as non-contingent reinforcement. And the way I've sort of organized the presentation is that I've just brought a whole bunch of stuff, and I kind of just want to see what people are interested in talking about, and I'll kind of give you some historical overviews, and we could get more specific on certain parts of the topic and maybe less specific on others. Another thing that I didn't know coming in is how many of you may have been at the presentation that I gave at this conference last year, and I wonder if by a show of hands you could let me know if you attended that one. Okay, a few of you did. So for those of you who were in the presentation last year, I apologize at the outset that the first part is going to be sort of a review of that because understanding what we talked about last year is critical to understanding what I'll be presenting primarily this year. Another aspect of this session that I wasn't sure about is I wasn't sure who exactly would be in the audience because I was told we have a number of parents here, a number of professionals, a number of teachers, a number of behavior analysts. Could you give me a show of hands if you are a parent? Okay, a good portion of you are. How many of you are behavior analysts? Okay, about equal. How many of you are teachers? Good portion. And how many of you are other professionals, speech, language pathologists, et cetera? Okay, so it's about a 25, 25, 25 split, which is kind of challenging for me as a presenter because there's some terminology that some of you will be familiar with, some that teachers are familiar with, but behavior analysts are not, some that behavior analysts are familiar with and teachers are not, and some that parents may or may not be familiar with. So I'll try to go through and define these concepts as much as I can and make sure we're all on the same page before I move to the final part of the presentation, which is really about the antecedent intervention. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that we are being, I guess it's called webcast, is that the term, right now? So when I'm giving presentations, I really enjoy participation, questions, comments from the audience, and that it's a little difficult on a webcast because, of course, the people watching it on the web can't hear your question. So what I'll do is I'll repeat your question, and if I get it a little wrong, you can kind of correct me, and then I'll re-specify the question. But I really would like us to have that kind of interaction. So if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to raise your hand, or comments, things to add, raise your hand, and we'll include that in the presentation. So don't feel badly if we don't get through everything that I have on the slides. It really isn't even intended for that. We'll get through whatever we get through, and hopefully there will be some other years or other times we can meet and go through the additional material. So as kind of an overview of what I'll be talking about today, just so you, whoops, there's a little ant or bug on there. I wanted to give you a little bit of a feel for where I do this research, the kind of context that I'm working in, and so on. And then I'm very briefly going to describe what is known as the operant functions of behavior disorders. I think by now most of you have probably had some contact with understanding why problematic behavior occurs. I know the behavior analysts in the audience probably are familiar with that. Some of you may not be on board with the exact terminology, but once I give some examples, I think you'll recognize, oh yeah, I've seen that in one of my students, or I've seen my child do that, that sort of thing. So we'll kind of go over that somewhat quickly. And then I'm going to contrast what we typically call antecedent interventions and consequence-based interventions. Now I want to emphasize that if you had to ask me, Tim, are you an advocate for antecedent-based interventions, or are you an advocate for consequence-based interventions? I would say I'm an advocate primarily for consequence-based interventions. And what I mean by that is that typically problematic behavior occurs because of the consequence it produces. So there's some favorable consequence for engaging in the problematic behavior. So consequence-based interventions involve minimizing that consequence and maximizing a favorable outcome for appropriate behavior. And I think that's the key to treatment of severe problem behavior. So you might say, well then why are you presenting on antecedent interventions if you are a proponent of consequence-based? I'm going to try to present my logic on that as we go through these topics this morning. We will talk about consequence-based interventions, and then I'll move to a discussion of situations when antecedent interventions are probably very important to understand. And specifically, those procedures are very important to understand when the problematic behavior is so dangerous that you need it to stop. And you need it to stop immediately before you can move on with the educational process or whatever it might be that the individual is involved with. So just for example, back in the old days, let's say the 1960s, if somebody had severe self-injurious behavior or severe aggression, typically what would happen is that individual would experience some kind of punishment procedure. So whether it would be electric shock or something like that. And the logic behind that was the behavior needed to stop. Well, of course, in modern day research and practice, we try to avoid that kind of intervention for a number of reasons. It lacks social validity, there's potential for abuse, and so on and so forth. Well, what I'd like to impart to you today is that we have another procedure up our sleeve that does not involve aversive stimulation, but it very reliably stops the problematic behavior from occurring almost immediately. And from there you can build an educational program or a learning program once you've wiped out the problematic behavior. And we have numerous examples of that in the literature, numerous examples of that from clinical practice, and so that is the role, I think, of the antecedent-based interventions. And then you build consequent-based interventions in with that. So that intervention that I will be describing.
I think your lavaliers on.
Pardon me?
Your lavalier. They're having a hard time hearing.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah. All right. Go ahead and try that.
Some kind of weird button. All right, I'm testing the mic. You got it in the back? Okay. All right, so that procedure that I just alluded to is very generally known as non-contingent reinforcement, and you'll see that there are variations of that, but typically what it involves is essentially eliminating the motivation to engage in problem behavior. So let me give you an example from my recent clinical experience. There was a young boy in the state of Florida who was engaging in severe aggression. He had beat up other students, he had beat up teachers, sent people to the hospital. Everybody was really afraid of this particular child. We conducted an assessment to try to figure out why the aggression was occurring. It was very clear that it was occurring because he was engaged in escape behavior. So when the teachers would ask him to do something he didn't want to do, he would start punching people, pulling their hair, even biting them, things of that nature. And the school day became a disaster. He was having over 100 episodes of this type of behavior. So given that we knew it was escape behavior, we needed to stop the behavior right away. We didn't want to use punishment, but we wanted the behavior to stop. So all we did was gave him non-contingent escape throughout the day. The teachers in the audience might be cringing, what? You're not going to give him any instruction? Now remember, this is a very serious form of behavior. He's hurt people. We want him in school. We want to eventually build up to a point where he can be receiving instructions like the rest of the students in the class, but he's not ready for that right now. He's not at that point because the aggression is too severe. So by completely eliminating the instructional demands, now I'm really loud, right? By completely eliminating the instructional demands, we were able to stop the behavior and then build a curriculum from there. And it worked immediately. We were immediately working with 0 instances of problem behavior from the day we started the intervention. I will conclude with some suggestions for how to actually apply these procedures. So I'll present the research, the evidence base for it, and then I'll make suggestions for how you would actually go about implementing these procedures in a classroom, in a home setting, in a clinical setting, or wherever you may work. And then time permitting, I always add one of these at the end, and just because I get involved in talking about the topic, I almost never get to the time permitting, but just in case, I'll show you some relatively recent research we've been working on with both PECS card training and iPad communication training, where we use non-contingent reinforcement as a test to see if the person is actually developing communication skills. Just in a nutshell, to kind of give you an idea about what this involves, is you've probably all seen the type of child who will have like a PECS book or an iPad and seemingly can rifle through it and tell you what they want and things like that. But then you start to wonder, I wonder if just everything in the PECS book is good, and so whatever he or she points to is fine with them. Well, what we've developed is a test where we actually give them an item for free, so it's non-contingent, and then from there we test, are they able to ask for the thing that they don't have, or the item that they don't have? And it turns out to be a very good test for whether or not the child is actually discriminating the PECS item or the item on the iPad and that sort of thing. So hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to go into that, but that's sort of the add-on if we have time. Okay. Having some technical issues here. There we go. Okay, so I mentioned that I would talk a little bit about the context of my research so you understand where some of these data are coming from and some of the information. A lot of my research, a large percentage of my research over the years has involved assessment of behavior disorders. And what that typically involves is trying to figure out why the problematic behavior occurs. Some of you may have attended Dr. Iwata's presentation yesterday. Dr. Iwata was actually my professor years ago at the University of Florida, and I learned the assessment process from working in his research laboratory, and then upon graduation extended that work to school-based, the school-based context and the home-based context. I also have a focus on treatment of behavior disorders maintained by social reinforcement contingencies. So as many of you probably know, the dangerous sorts of behavior like self-injurious behavior, aggressive behavior, property destruction are very frequently inadvertently maintained by some social consequence. It's not as if parents or teachers or other adults are trying to reinforce or trying to maintain the behavior, but our natural reaction to that behavior sometimes reinforces it. So for example, if you're a parent and your child is engaging in self-injury, your natural response as a parent is to try to comfort them or to try to figure out what's causing them distress, and by so doing, you might be inadvertently strengthening the behavior. Another example might be in a school context where a teacher would walk up to a student and say, okay, it's time to start doing your math, and the child starts banging his head on a desk or biting his hand. The teacher might say, okay, we'll come back to that later. That's a natural response from an adult, but that response might inadvertently strengthen the behavior. The child learns, oh, if I start biting myself, banging my hand, or banging my head, I don't have to engage in the schoolwork. So a lot of our treatments are designed around the notion that we have to switch around those social reinforcement contingencies where we reinforce some appropriate alternative behavior. The reason I have this one in bold is because primarily that's what we'll be focusing on today. In fact, last year when I presented, I talked for a whole day about treatment of socially reinforced problematic behavior. Today we'll be a little bit more focused on this antecedent intervention. But I would be remiss to, if I did not point out that a large focus of our research at Florida has also been involving treatment of behavior disorders maintained by automatic reinforcement. And what I mean by automatic reinforcement is when the problematic behavior produces its own source of reinforcement. So a lot of times we mistakenly view all problematic behavior as something that's producing some kind of social reinforcement. So we'll go into a classroom and look at behavior and say, oh, it must be maintained by attention because the teacher's always attending to it. Sometimes that attention is just incidental. I like to liken it to something like a sneeze. A common example is when somebody sneezes, the typical consequence is that someone will say, bless you, but saying bless you doesn't reinforce the sneeze, right? So there's a correlation, but there's not a cause and effect relationship. Similarly, with some problematic behavior, let's say self-injury, the person will engage in the behavior even when they're alone, in a room by themselves. It's not maintained by social reinforcement contingencies. So doing things like ignoring that behavior will have no effect because your attention doesn't matter. That's not the reason the behavior is occurring. So we've done a lot of research in that realm, and I don't want, through this presentation, to falsely lead you to believe that all behavior problems are socially reinforced. They're certainly not. And I would love to come back another year and do an entire day or entire morning just on treatments for automatically reinforced behavior. It's very different, but I wanted to point out that it's equally important. It's just not what we're talking about today. And then a major area of my research over the years has involved parent, teacher, and care provider training. The way I like to think about this is that we can get certain effects within a clinical context or within a research context, but those effects are meaningless unless they translate to the child or adult's home, living, or educational or work environment. So we focus very much on making sure that the procedures that we develop can then be implemented by individuals in the actual environment. And I think that you got a brief overview of my career path earlier, but I just kind of wanted to point out where my career development occurred. As I mentioned, I studied with Brian Iwata at the University of Florida in the late 1980s, early 1990s, received my PhD in '92. My first academic job was at Louisiana State University, and the interesting thing about this for me was I got hired into a school psychology program, which was a sub-area of psychology. To that point in my life, I had never worked in a school ever. So I went from working in a residential facility with Dr. Iwata and his other graduate students to working in a school psychology program where I was training school psychologists. Well, I thought to myself, what we were doing in the residential facility is certainly applicable to these preschool, elementary, middle school, and high school age kids, and so we just applied it in the school context. And I was there from 1992 to 1996. Then I was recruited to the University of Pennsylvania. At the time, the Children's Seashore House had an inpatient behavioral unit, and we were doing a lot of our behavioral assessment and treatment work in that context. And then in 1998, I returned to the University of Florida. My work at the University of Florida is conducted in the context of our school-based research. We have several schools around the Gainesville area where we have relationships with the administration and the teachers, and we work with them very carefully on assessing problematic behavior, skill development with kids with autism and intellectual disabilities. And then also, if the parents are interested, we get involved in parent training for those students as well. We have a new behavior analysis research clinic. It's right on campus, and this is just a few short steps from my office, so at any time, if my students have questions or anything, I can go down and observe what's happening. But in the context of that clinic, we train undergraduate students to become behavior analysts. We train graduate students to become board certified behavior analysts. Some of my senior graduate students already are board certified behavior analysts. They're going for their doctoral degree, and they supervise the other board certified behavior analysts. And so kids primarily from the Gainesville community come in during the school year. It would be after school. If they're preschool age, sometimes they'll come during the school hours and receive behavior analytic interventions and skill acquisition programming. And my group also does consultation. We have contracts with some of the local school districts to provide behavior analysis services in those school districts. So that's primarily where most of this work has occurred in these contexts, either in our clinic, in our school-based research, or through our consultation. Just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page, when I'm talking about behavior disorders in autism and intellectual disabilities, I think probably everybody in this audience has seen these types of behaviors, but I just want to kind of go through to make sure we're all on the same page. So self-injurious behavior can include anything ranging from head banging to self-scratching to head hitting, hand biting. Basically anything that you can think of that would involve injury to oneself. We've seen that in one form or another, tearing off toenails, pulling out hair, whatever it might be, eye poking. So self-injury is one of the things that we consider to be a severe behavior disorder. Of course, aggression, which is behavior that can produce pain or harm to another individual. Property destruction can range from putting holes in the wall, breaking windows, throwing computers across the room, things of that nature. Tantrums involves behavior that sometimes impedes a child or adult's ability to go out into the community because they might engage in loud screaming or flopping on the floor, things like that in public places, in the stores, restaurants, and that interferes with the family's well-being or the classroom teacher and classroom context. Sometimes we include severe stereotypic behavior in this category of severe behavior disorders. Not always, because some stereotypic or highly repetitive behavior like hand flapping, body rocking, things of that nature, doesn't necessarily interfere with what the child is learning or doing. At other times it can be disruptive and interfering. Some examples of that would be a parent comes to us and says, I'm embarrassed to go to the mall because my child will run out to the center of the hallway and just start rocking back and forth really fast, and it scares little kids and stuff like that. So in situations like that where it's disruptive to the family or disruptive to what the individual can experience, then we might treat the behavior as if it's akin to a severe behavior disorder. And then there are miscellaneous others that we sometimes run across, like pica, which involves eating inedible objects and things of that nature. So I mentioned that I would briefly review the operant functions of behavior disorders. And I know some of you attended Dr. Wada's presentation. Some of you attended my presentation last year, and many of you have probably just encountered this information somewhere along the way. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, other than to say that we do know that a significant portion of severe behavior disorders are learned operant behavior. And some of that is learned through socially mediated consequences. One such example is socially mediated positive reinforcement. Now, it's important to recognize here that positive reinforcement does not necessarily mean it's a good thing. In our media and in our culture, people tend to use the term positive reinforcement as if it's an inherently good thing. Well, all positive reinforcement means is that behavior is strengthened. That's what is meant by reinforcement. And positive means because something is delivered. So something is delivered that strengthens the behavior. In this case, we're talking about strengthening problematic behavior. And some examples of positive reinforcement can come in the form of attention from an adult. So you might have experienced a situation where you are talking to another child or helping another child, and then a different child starts engaging in problematic behavior, seemingly to draw your attention to them, so that now you're interacting with them. And there is mounds and mounds of empirical evidence to support the notion that a significant portion of problematic behavior is inadvertently maintained by that attention. It's a natural reaction to tell the person, stop doing that, don't do that, you're going to hurt someone, you're going to hurt yourself. But when we do that, at times we're delivering positive reinforcement for the behavior. Other examples would include inadvertently delivering tangible items to the individual. Last year I gave an example that I'll repeat here because it's one of the best examples I can think of. Many years ago, when I was working at LSU, we were asked to come out and see this child who engaged in severe tantrums. He was not speaking. He was about 3 years old, maybe close to 4. So one of the graduate students in the program at the time, actually some of you may know her, Linda LeBlanc, was a graduate student in the clinical program at LSU. She and I went out to observe this child interacting with his family, and for many hours he was doing nice parallel play with his older brother, no problematic behavior or anything like that, and we were just kind of chatting with the family. And at one point the child wandered into the kitchen, and when he wandered into the kitchen, the father said, "You're about to see it. You're about to see what we're talking about." So we kind of all just watched, and the child went over to the refrigerator and just let out the loudest shriek I think I've ever heard, and it just wouldn't stop. And so the father said, what should I do? And I said, well, we need to see what you would normally do. Well, you can imagine what any well-meaning father would do. He said, well, what I do is I try to figure out what he wants. So he went to the refrigerator, he started like pulling out the milk, the shrieking didn't stop, pulled out some juice, shrieking didn't stop, pulled out some iced tea, the shrieking stopped. So the father basically was trying to figure out what would stop his child from tantruming, but in so doing had inadvertently reinforced the behavior. So you can see how the father's behavior was reinforced. I mean, who among us as parents do not feel a good sensation when our child stops crying or feeling distressed? But from the child's perspective, that was the way to get the iced tea, the juice, the milk, or whatever it happened to be at that time. So of course, with our treatment, what we did is we taught the child a different way to ask for tea, juice, milk, etc. But at that point in his development, the parents were doing what they thought was the right thing, except they were inadvertently reinforcing the behavior. So I don't think I've ever met a parent or a teacher who intentionally strengthens the behavior. We're all just doing what we think is the best thing to do. Sometimes the problematic behavior is maintained by socially mediated negative reinforcement. Now, those of you in the audience who are not behavior analysts might not know exactly what we mean by negative reinforcement. The term is commonly used, and it's often used incorrectly in the media. A lot of people think negative reinforcement means punishment or delivering some kind of aversive stimulation. Negative reinforcement still involves strengthening behavior. It involves making the behavior stronger, but it does so by removing some kind of stimulation. So whereas positive reinforcement is delivering attention, delivering iced tea, whatever it might be, negative reinforcement involves removing something like an instructional demand. So that would be the example that I gave of a teacher walking up and saying, time to do your math. The problem behavior occurs, then the teacher removes him or herself and removes the academic demand. That would be an example of negatively reinforcing problematic behavior. Interestingly, when President Obama was speaking on the Trayvon Martin case, he used the term negative reinforcement, but he used it in a way that implied he meant punishment. And so you hear that in the media quite a bit. Even some talk show type psychologists will use the term negative reinforcement when they mean punishment. But really what the term means is to strengthen behavior by removing some kind of aversive stimulation. And then, as I mentioned, sometimes the problem behavior has nothing to do with the social environment. So a child might engage in problematic behavior because it produces some kind of pleasing sensation. You might be familiar with the hypothesis that has been floating around for maybe close to 30 years now, the endorphin hypothesis of self-injury. There's a notion that, for example, when people run a marathon, that they get a high from running the marathon. There's been a hypothesis for years about the possibility that people, when they deliver blows to their head, they're producing endorphins, or naturally occurring neurotransmitters that are similar to morphine or heroin in chemical structure, and that the person might be getting a high from the behavior. The research on that is still pretty mixed, because the treatment for that would be to do something like present an opiate blocker. There's drugs like naltrexone, for example, that block endorphins at the receptor site. Naltrexone is a drug that is given to individuals who are ODing on heroin. So when they go to the hospital, they give them a drug like naltrexone. It blocks the activity at the receptor site, and then they don't OD. Well, the notion is, if somebody's hitting themselves to produce that sensation and you present the naltrexone, it should block that activity at the receptor site and the behavior should go away. The reason the research on it is so mixed is that typically, the researchers have not done a functional analysis before giving the naltrexone to the naltrexone group or the placebo to another group. And so everybody's lumped in. We already know that a whole bunch of people with self-injurious behavior do it because it's maintained by socially mediated positive reinforcement or socially mediated negative reinforcement, so they shouldn't even be included in the study. All it does is water down the results. So the definitive study on the naltrexone hypothesis hasn't been done. But nonetheless, we do know that some people engage in self-injurious behavior or even property destruction when there's no other social consequences that occur. So it's easy to always assume that it's somehow socially reinforced, but that's not always the case. Automatic negative reinforcement is another example. If somebody has, let's say, a bug bite on their arm, they might scratch it to the point of bleeding, and then as it's healing, they still get that itching sensation, so they scratch it some more, and it bleeds, and this is kind of a cycle that goes on. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you provide attention or whether or not you provide escape from the instructional activity. That behavior is occurring because it produces its own source of reinforcement. Other examples are, some of you may have seen when a child has an earache, like very young children with an earache will bop at their ear. Well, it appears that sometimes that might actually develop into more serious self-injurious behavior that sometimes even enters into socially mediated consequences. So a parent sees their child bopping at their ear, and the natural reaction is to say, don't do that, you're going to hurt yourself. And now the child learns, oh, this is a good way to get to sit on mom's lap, or maybe mom will start to play with me, or something like that. So those automatic reinforcement contingencies start to interact with the socially mediated contingencies. The methodology that has proven these operant functions of behavior is the methodology that Dr. Wada talked about on Monday, and that is a functional analysis. A functional analysis is very similar to an allergy test in the sense that when you go to the allergist, she might poke you in the back and look at where you swell up and say, oh, you're allergic to grass or something like that. Well, behavior analysts expose people to all of these possible reinforcement contingencies and look to see where behavior swells up. So in this case, if you look at this floating data path right here, for George, his behavior always occurred in the attention condition. In the attention condition, we intentionally give him attention following the problematic behavior to see if it reinforces the behavior. In all of the other conditions, like escape from instructional activity, when he's alone with no interaction, he doesn't engage in the problem behavior. So this is an example demonstrating that attention functioned as positive reinforcement for the behavior. Here are two examples of positive reinforcement in the form of tangible positive reinforcers. I talked about these two guys last year, so those of you who were in the talk might recognize these stories, but they're sort of textbook examples of behavior maintained by positive reinforcement in the form of tangible items. Todd was a 9-year-old boy who lived with his grandmother, and he was actually taken to the hospital because of the severity of his aggression. And he was another one for whom we watched him interacting with his grandmother for probably a good 2 hours, maybe even longer, and didn't see any of the aggression. And so we were observing from these one-way windows into a hospital room that was set up to look like sort of a family room in a home or something like that. And at one point, my students came and got me and said, we're not seeing anything, what's going on? And so I walked into the room and I talked to the grandmother and I said, you've hospitalized him for the aggression. You said it occurs all the time. We're not seeing it. What do you think is different? And she said, "Oh, you want to see the aggression?" And when we said, "Yeah, we'd like to see it," she said, "Okay, go get me some potato chips." So I gave one of my graduate students $1 and sent them down to the vending machine. They came back with some chips. We left the room. The grandmother opened the bag of chips, and this kid, a 9-year-old kid, jumped up on her, put his legs around her waist, and started going for her glasses. And she gave him the chips, and he calmed down. We, of course, walked in, immediately stopped the session, but then we replicated that with our trained behavior analysts and found that as he learned that contingency, he would start to engage in aggression because it produced food. So his problem behavior was related to getting access to food. He was a child who had no communication skills at that point in his life. Similarly, another 9-year-old was Dale, except Dale, unlike Todd, who was probably typical size or maybe even smaller than most 9-year-olds, Dale was huge. At 9 years old, he was the size I am right now, and I'm not exaggerating. His mother, on the other hand, was at best 5'2", maybe 120 pounds, and he had, if I'm remembering correctly, several younger siblings. And he was very aggressive in the context of food and also in the context of watching videos. So if you turned off his video, he would become very aggressive. If he saw food in the environment, he would become very aggressive to gain access to those items. And again, just like with Dale, his assessment outcome shows the highest levels of problem behavior in that particular assessment condition. So that's kind of how we have established the literature base for these notions that the problem behavior can be maintained by positive reinforcement in some way. Similarly, we see assessment outcomes that point to behavior maintained by negative reinforcement. This young man, Kevin, I think was about 17 at the time we worked with him in a school in Louisiana. And what we had noticed was that his teacher and paraprofessional would bring a chair whenever he had to walk from point A to point B in the school. And he would start punching himself really hard in the face when he was walking through the school halls. And what they would do is give him a, quotes, timeout when he started to punch himself, and he would sit and relax on the chair for a while, and then they'd say, "Are you ready to go?" And he'd get up and start walking again, and after a while start punching himself, and then they'd have him sit down in a timeout. Well, we hypothesized that they were inadvertently negatively reinforcing the behavior by providing him with escape from the walking. So we replicated that in the context of our assessment, and all of these high data points in the assessment are sessions when we were allowing him to escape from the walking. I'm going to come back to Kevin because he's one of the early cases in which we applied the antecedent intervention that I'll be focusing on in the second half of our discussion. And Mark was a little guy, also in Louisiana, who was in preschool. And when we first started his assessment, we never saw, or very rarely saw, his self-injurious behavior. So we went back into his preschool classroom environment and saw that really the only time it occurred was when the teacher made him do tabletop tasks. So like desk work and working at a table with a group. Then he'd start biting his hand, banging his head, and things like that. And her typical response was to send him away from the table, and he would stop engaging in the behavior. So we replicated that in our assessment here and found that his behavior was in fact socially negatively reinforced by escape from the instructional context. Just a couple quick examples of behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement. What the pattern looks like here is that typically you'll see very high levels of the behavior in all of the test conditions, and then even when there's no social consequence, the behavior persists, which is what is represented by this data path here. Then this outcome was for a little girl with, who we later found out had Rett syndrome. At the time that I did this assessment, I didn't even know what Rett syndrome was. And then one of the reviewers of our manuscript when we submitted it, Wayne Fisher, who's a prominent behavior analyst, said, it sounds like this little girl has Rett syndrome. She would constantly wring her hands and put her hands in her mouth. And so what we were targeting was hand mouthing, because she had done it to such an extent that her skin was worn down on her fingers. And as you can see, no matter what the environmental condition, she kept doing it, and even when she was left alone. So it was almost constant that she had her hands in her mouth. Subsequently, based on that review, we mentioned it to her mother, and this was before the actual genetic testing for Rett syndrome, and she went through the clinical test and was in fact diagnosed with Rett syndrome. And then years later, we followed up and found out that she had the genetic testing and did in fact have Rett syndrome. But her behavior was automatically reinforced. It didn't have anything to do with the social consequences. Okay, so before I move on to sort of distinguishing between these categories of intervention that we'll be talking about today, does anyone have any questions or comments about these operant functions of behavior? Socially mediated positive reinforcement, socially mediated negative reinforcement, or automatic reinforcement? Do those distinctions all make sense? Okay, so understanding that is really a premise for understanding the antecedent interventions, and I think you'll see why shortly. Okay, so let's distinguish between antecedent and consequence-based interventions. The antecedent-based interventions operate by changing something that occurs before the behavior ever has a chance to occur. All right, that's what is meant by antecedent. It's before the behavior. Okay. And the specific one that I'll be talking about today involves changing the motivation to engage in problem behavior. So let me give you a very simple example in day-to-day life. Okay, let's suppose you're at a restaurant, and the moment you sit down, the waiter or waitress pours a glass of water, of ice water for you. There is absolutely zero motivation for you to say, excuse me, waiter, could I have some water? Right, because you already have water, right? So they've eliminated the motivation to engage in the behavior of asking for water. Now let's suppose you go to another restaurant and you're sitting there for about 5 minutes and they give you some chips and you're eating the salty chips and you have nothing to drink. You're highly motivated to say, may I have some water, please? Okay, so those are very distinct antecedent conditions. Now similarly, with problematic behavior, it might be, let's say, behavior maintained by attention. In one context, we might give the person continuous attention, in which case they have zero motivation to engage in attention-maintained behavior. In another case, we might be running around the classroom attending to all kinds of different things that are happening in the classroom, and if attention is important for that student, they're highly motivated to engage in attention-maintained behavior. So those are very distinct contexts. The antecedent interventions are aimed at trying to arrange the environment, at least at first, to eliminate the motivation to the best extent possible. Whereas consequence-based interventions aim to eliminate the reinforcement for the problematic behavior and to teach some replacement behavior. Now, that particular type of intervention is what I spent 6 hours talking about last year. I'm going to just briefly touch on it this year because I want to be clear that I still believe that is the most powerful intervention that we should be aiming for, is to try to minimize reinforcement for the problem behavior and maximize reinforcement for some replacement behavior. Ultimately, that is critical. But the problem is that sometimes we just need the behavior to stop immediately. We can't even get to the point where we can do this consequence-based intervention because the behavior is too dangerous. It is at that point that we introduce the antecedent interventions. So the consequence-based intervention that I have described here on this slide is essentially a procedure that we call differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement, just in a nutshell, involves minimizing reinforcement for problem behavior, maximizing reinforcement for some alternative or other behavior. So for example, going back to attention-maintained behavior, if a child starts engaging in problematic behavior, we might do whatever it takes to make sure the person's safe, so we're not completely ignoring them, but we're protecting them, but we're minimizing our attention. Whereas if they do something like tap us on the shoulder or say, hey, come play with me, then we load on the attention. So we're making it so that if they have a choice, they're much more likely to engage in the appropriate behavior because it pays off more. So the kind of heuristic or the rule of thumb, as I described it last year, is minimize, maximize. Minimize reinforcement for problem behavior, maximize reinforcement for some alternative behavior that serves the same purpose or function. So problematic behavior is sometimes defined as what behavior analysts call choice. I'm going to define that a little more carefully later, but essentially what I mean is that as a person moves through the day, they have a choice. I can either hit you, or I can tap you, or say, hey, come play with me. The evidence is overwhelming that what the person is going to do is whichever one pays off more. So if they tap you and say, hey, come play, and that only produces someone's attention 1 out of every 10 times, or once every 3 hours or something like that, whereas hitting them produces attention reliably, that's what they're going to do. And the data are overwhelming. It's clear if behavior is maintained by attention, like in one of those functional analyses, that's what's going on in the environment. They're getting more attention for the problem behavior than they are for the appropriate behavior. So the whole purpose of a behavioral treatment is to flip that contingency around. Okay? So differential reinforcement involves essentially stacking the deck in favor of appropriate behavior. So we want to make sure that that behavior is going to pay off more than the problematic behavior. And just to reiterate the simple rule of thumb or heuristic, maximize, minimize. We've actually done parent training where that has been the focus of the training, maximize, minimize. And the reason that we focus on that is that years ago, we learned that saying ignore that behavior is just not a good instruction to parents or teachers, because most of the time, by the time we get in there, it's behavior that can't be ignored. Somebody's going to get hurt if the behavior is ignored, or something is going to be destroyed. So minimize just means do what you have to do to protect people, to protect the person, to protect your computer. You have to do that, but you can minimize your reaction. You don't have to go into a 20-minute lecture about why we don't destroy computers or something like that. You can minimize your reaction, and then maximize your reaction to the appropriate behavior. So a good example of this type of differential reinforcement is a procedure we call DRA, or differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. DRA is essentially a concurrent schedule. And let me tell you a little bit about how concurrent schedules work. A concurrent schedule means that there is just 2 or more options available to obtain reinforcement. In a very simple way of thinking about it, just suppose there's a big green button on that side of the room and a big yellow button on that side of the room. If you press the yellow button, you get $1. If you press the green button, you get $100. Obviously, you're going to spend most of your time over there pressing the green button because it produces more reinforcement. That's a concurrent schedule. The green button wins out because it has a more favorable outcome. So our research has shown that as kids move through the world, even adults with intellectual disabilities or autism move through the world, it's not as if they're constantly calculating which one pays off, but their behavior is sensitive to that. So whichever option, if it's tapping you or saying hi, pays off more than hitting you, they're going to tap you and say hi more than they hit you. Then the inverse is true. So differential reinforcement of alternative behavior just means that we need to make sure we're strengthening some replacement behavior. Before the treatment starts, or what we call the baseline circumstance, baseline circumstances usually favor problematic behavior. So when we go in and watch what's happening in a classroom environment or in a home environment, what we see is that the problem behavior pays off more than the appropriate behavior. So I'm going to go through a hypothetical example in a minute, but just to give you a sense of this, how often have you seen something like a student is in a classroom and the student raises his or her hand and the teacher says, "Just a minute, Tom, I'm busy. I'll be there in a minute." And then they talk to another student, and then eventually, if they come back to the first student who raised his hand, they'll look at his work and say, "Oh, good, okay, that's nice," and then walk away. Conversely, if Tom had pulled the hair of the girl sitting next to him and then pushed his desk over, the teacher's going to immediately run over, immediately attend to him, maybe even have him come sit next to her in the front of the classroom, and maybe give about a 10-minute lecture about the classroom rules. So he just got a whole bunch of attention in a whole bunch of different ways for engaging in the problem behavior, and his attention for appropriate behavior was very brief, qualitatively low, and probabilistic. Probably sometimes the teacher forgets to come back. And this isn't to blame the teacher in this circumstance, because the teacher has so many responsibilities, so many other things going on, and you have to respond in some way to the problematic behavior. So we're going to come back to some possible solutions for that, which was the emphasis of our discussion from last year. Now, the treatment circumstance represents schedules that favor appropriate behavior. What we do is we actually list what happens when problem behavior occurs and what happens when appropriate behavior occurs. And a good exercise for typically functioning adults is to look at it and say, what if instead of attention or instead of escape, what if that was money? What would I do? Because money is a good general conditioned reinforcer for all of us. So if you would look at a situation and say, well, of course I would do this, then if that column represents what happens when problem behavior occurs for our students and for our children, that's what they're going to do. Whatever pays off more, we have mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds of data to suggest that's what they're going to do. Now, ideally, what we'd want to do is place the problem behavior on extinction. And that's typically what we shoot for. And what that means is that that behavior produces no reinforcement. So we would ignore if we could ignore, basically. Or if it's escape behavior, we would continue with the instructional activity. That makes it really easy to stack the deck in favor of reinforcing appropriate behavior, right? Because there is no reinforcement for problem behavior. However, there are circumstances when extinction is not possible or not practical. Let me give you some examples. For one thing, for any of us who have worked in schools or clinical environments, we know that treatment integrity failures occur. The very best teachers, the very best parents, the very best behavior analysts, the very best speech pathologists, we all make mistakes. So every time we make a mistake, the schedule is no longer extinction, right? When we accidentally provide attention to the behavior one time, it's no longer an extinction schedule. In fact, for the behavior analysts in the room, you'll recognize what it is now is a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. What that means is every once in a while it gets reinforced. Well, if you've ever been to Las Vegas or Atlantic City, you know what variable ratio schedules of reinforcement do. They keep behavior going for a really long time. Just look at the slot machines. People are engaging in behavior that in the long run produces a loss of reinforcement, but just because it sometimes produces reinforcement, it will maintain for a long period of time. So when we make integrity failures, when we make mistakes in our treatments, we're putting behavior on a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. And what that means is the behavior is likely to get stronger and stronger. So extinction probably isn't going to happen most of the time, even if we think we can make extinction happen. There might also be legal or ethical requirements to block attention, maintain self-injury, or aggression. So if I'm a teacher in a classroom and you as a behavior analyst come in, or a school psychologist come in and you tell me, I want you to ignore his aggression. And when I ignore his aggression, another student ends up with a bloody face or hair torn out of her scalp. For ethical and legal reasons, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to attend to the behavior because I have to protect the other students in the classroom, all right? So that has to be taken into account. If we say ignore the behavior, which I admit I did early in my career, I used to say to parents and teachers, just ignore the behavior, until I realized just how absolutely ridiculous that was in the case of severe behavior disorders. We can't always ignore the behavior. Then, if we recognize that people are going to have to attend to the behavior in some way, then we realize extinction isn't always going to be a part of our differential reinforcement procedure. Further, the behavior is sometimes maintained by automatic reinforcement. So if I tell you ignore the behavior, that might not do anything to the schedule of reinforcement because the behavior is producing its own source of reinforcement. Think about something like cigarette smoking. Okay, most people don't smoke cigarettes because it produces attention. So you're not smoking and then someone comes up and says, stop doing that, you're gonna hurt yourself, why don't you stop smoking? No, you do it because it produces some kind of automatic reinforcement. Now maybe early on when you started smoking, you got some peer attention and things like that, but it eventually enters into automatic reinforcement contingencies. So no matter how much we tell somebody, ignore that cigarette smoking, that will have no effect on the cigarette smoking. So if problem behavior by our students or our kids is automatically reinforced, ignoring it won't have any effect. And then finally, although I could go on with numerous other examples, large and or fast individuals may produce escape even if we attempt escape extinction. So I used to bring a photo, but in the interest of time I didn't bring it. I've had students who are over 300 pounds, you know, 8th graders that weigh 325 pounds with a teacher who weighs maybe 130 pounds or something like that. There's no way that teacher can do escape extinction, which would involve hand over hand requiring the student to finish whatever it was she was asking him to do. So if that student attacks the teacher, he's going to get a break, okay? That's going to happen, and we learned that pretty early on. So in these cases, if you can't implement extinction, how do you make differential reinforcement work? And again, for those of you who were in the audience last year, I'm just summarizing what we already talked about in a 6-hour session. I'm trying to boil it down to 20 or 30 minutes here, but what we have to do is we just have to look at stacking the deck. So let's look at what happens in baseline. Let's suppose that some student has attention-maintained aggression. So this student has learned, if I attack other people in the classroom or if I attack the teacher, I'm guaranteed to get this big bundle of attention, and attention is like money for me. This student loves attention and will work really hard to get attention. We've all seen kids like this. So if we evaluate what's going on, the probability of attention in baseline for this student is probably 1.0. In all cases, when aggression occurs, it reliably produces attention. Now let's say the student has some other forms of appropriate attention-seeking behavior, like raising his hand, maybe he has some vocalizations like, hey, or come talk to me, something like that. But it's not something that reliably produces the attention. It might be easy to ignore or leave well enough alone, he's doing fine, I'm not going to come over and talk. Or maybe the teacher or the parent is busy and they say, I'll come over in a little while. So the probability might be, let's say, something like 0.2. What about the delay to attention? With aggressive behavior, we have to attend immediately or else somebody's going to get hurt. So a really good responder would probably do something like get there in less than 3 seconds or less than 5 seconds. So aggression produces immediate attention. That would be like immediate money as opposed to delayed money, where appropriate behavior might produce attention sometime later, like, okay, I'll come over in a few minutes, I'll come see you, but it's delayed. So now you've got a lower probability of attention for appropriate behavior, and it's much more delayed. What about the quality? Well, if aggression occurs, there's usually going to be a verbal exchange and some physical attention, right? Whereas if some appropriate behavior has occurred, a very common adult response is, oh, nice job, or way to go, something like that. So a very brief verbal exchange compared to verbal and physical attention. What about the duration? Well, if you've ever seen a struggle surrounding aggression, it's 20 seconds is probably the lower limit. It's at least 20 seconds usually, sometimes upwards of 15 minutes to a half hour of physical and verbal attention. And as I said, the brief verbal attention is usually a very short duration, good job, or way to go, something like that. So these are the kinds of columns we create with kids we're working with. Take a look at this and ask yourself, if that were me, and instead of attention, that was money, what are you going to do? I mean, it's obvious, it's very clear how you're going to allocate your behavior. Because for this kid, our assessment shows attention is like money, or escape from instruction is like money, or getting potato chips is like getting money. So these reinforcers are very potent for them, and when you line it up this way, and I can tell you this is hypothetical, but it matches what we've seen in dozens and dozens of our assessments. When we see this kind of outcome, it's pretty clear what we need to do. We need to flip it around. Now the problem is, because it's aggressive behavior, as I already pointed out, we can't eliminate reinforcement for the aggressive behavior if it's maintained by attention. It's going to produce some attention. So let's see what the solution might be. What about the probability of attention? We have to provide attention when the problem behavior occurs, but we could provide equal attention when appropriate behavior occurs. And the way I typically present this to parents and teachers when I'm working with them is I say, pretend the appropriate behavior is aggression or property destruction. Act like you act when that behavior occurs. An example I gave to the group last year was we were working with some students in Iowa, and we had a kid who literally destroyed computers. He would take like keyboards and smash them, or he would take the whole computer and turn it over. And he was basically kicked out of the computer lab. He was not allowed to come back. So we worked with him in a separate room and taught him to raise his hand. And when he would raise his hand, we'd run over to him like he was about to destroy the computer, and taught him that he could reliably get our attention in that way. Then we transferred him back into the computer lab, and that's what we did. We would run to him when he raised his hand, and he got a kick out of seeing us clumsily run over to the computer and things like that. But it worked, and it was the reason it worked is because he was getting the attention just as quickly and just as reliably. And that sort of relates to how we can set up the delay. We can at least equate the delay to attention by treating it as if the problem behavior had just occurred. So now we're on a level playing field, at least, right, as compared to what we had in baseline. Here's where we might win. Do we have to have a verbal exchange with someone when they're aggressive? No. We might have to give an instruction here or there just to ensure everyone's safety, but we can certainly minimize that verbal exchange. All we have to do is physically intervene, do whatever it takes to protect people in the environment. However, when the appropriate behavior occurs, we can load on the verbal exchange. So when we would run over to that kid who destroyed computers, we'd pull up a chair and sit next to him and talk about what he was working on and give him 5 and rub his shoulders and pat his hand and just load on the physical and verbal attention so that it was better than the attention that he would get if the problem behavior occurred. And then we always had sort of a rule of thumb that whenever we got kind of tired of sitting there talking to him, do it a little bit more. Always make sure that the duration of the interaction outweighs the duration of the interaction when the problem behavior occurs. So can we completely eliminate reinforcement for aggression, property destruction? No. But we can line the 2 columns up and ask ourselves, how can we make it win out? All right. So this is what I presented to the group last year, and I present it now because I want to be clear that this is still the approach that I believe to be optimal. I think this is ultimately the way behavioral interventions have to be developed. You have to do an assessment to figure out why the behavior is occurring. You have to evaluate why problem behavior is occurring more than appropriate behavior. Then you have to switch those contingencies around to favor appropriate behavior. That is state-of-the-art behavioral intervention. Just a quick example of how we applied that notion. This individual had attention-maintained problem behavior. All of the problem behavior we saw in the assessment occurred in the attention condition. And then, I'm not going to go into the details, but just basically what we did is, for all of those different things, probability of reinforcement, quality of reinforcement, duration of reinforcement, we had them win out for appropriate behavior. And a mand is essentially a request for a reinforcer, in this case a request for attention. So he started engaging in mands instead of the problem behavior during the treatment. We went back to a baseline and then back to treatment, and then had his teacher implement the treatment at the end. And his behavior was not placed on extinction. He was still getting reinforcement for problem behavior. It's just that he was getting more and better reinforcement for appropriate behavior. In your handout, you should have a listing of this intervention, the citation for this, if you're interested in reading about it more. Okay, so this is a good segue, because now for the second half, what we will be discussing is this antecedent intervention and the context in which those antecedent interventions would be introduced. So I think it's a good time to take about a 10-minute break or so. We'll reconvene around 10:25, 10:30, and we'll move to the second half of our discussion. We have, public transport and automatic enforcement, but not the low frequency.
Yeah, well, he's also.
Yeah, that's one, a lot of research on that. It seems like really good stuff.
Yes.
But strong enough that I have to.
Oh, I scripted them all. The only conversations I really ever had. Anyway, hopefully I'll move on. It's, yeah, I mean, that's what he does. He acts alone. He does it all. That's interesting.
Are you the
You research on that.
Are you
No, I'm now Florida, so I used to, I looked at where do you live? Maybe a little more water just in case I lose my voice.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, I think we probably should get started again. And keep in mind, feel free to ask questions as we go along, but I'll also try to leave a period at the end for questions, and then also so you get your activity number. Yeah, and I also learned on the break that sometimes the sound next door gets really loud. We can't really hear that up here, but if you're not hearing me in the back, please raise your hand so I know to repeat what I said when the sound gets loud next door. Okay, before I get started on the second half of our discussion today, did anyone have any questions or comments? We got some really good questions in the break. Yes, in the back.
Well, I could see in my situation last year, I would have had a student loving me, running to him, and then that becoming the new behavior of getting that kind of attention. Now, I definitely agree that what you were suggesting and the whole program would be perfect in a perfect situation where you had more adults, perhaps less students. But in some cases, I could see some clever students using that as their new behavior.
That's a really good point. Let me try to summarize the comment. I was using the example of running up to the student to give attention for the appropriate behavior of raising the hand as opposed to breaking the computers or throwing the keyboard and that sort of thing. And the point being made was that then the raising of the hand becomes this pervasive behavior that continues to occur and demands a lot of attention from the teacher, and where that might work in a richly staffed environment, that in a real classroom environment where there may be fewer adults and professionals in the room, that might become problematic in itself. Did I summarize that okay? Yeah, and that's a big issue. And the way that we typically address that is, at first, we're looking at it as the behavior of breaking a computer and breaking a keyboard is so bad, it's so expensive and destructive to the property that we just need to get rid of that at first. And so we've had situations where people say, I can't run over when he raises his hand because I've got all these other students. But the fact of the matter is, you do run over when he raises that keyboard up above his head. So at first, we just simply want to replace the behavior, and it's going to be very effortful. And a lot of times, schools will have to put additional personnel to implement that intervention because the choice is either he's going to break computers or we're going to get this intervention going. But what I didn't talk about today, and we did talk about it last year, and if I was giving a more thorough discussion of differential reinforcement, the next step is to then work on delay to reinforcement. And so that has been done historically in a number of different ways. One way is to just gradually start to increase the delay, where raising the hand only works if you've waited X period of time. The recent research has shown that a better way to do that is to have a signal. So the signal would say when the teacher's attention is available and when it's not available. And you gradually increase the amount of time when the unavailable signal is up. And the research on it is pretty striking, that as long as you start with a very short interval, you can teach that during this interval, no attention is available. During this interval, attention is available, and you gradually thin it out that way. Now, it still is going to require great resources at the beginning, but that type of intervention would be reserved for situations when you've got a significant problem. Either somebody's getting hurt or thousands of dollars of equipment is being destroyed. Then your initial choice is, do we allocate resources to treat this, or do we let the stuff get broken? So I think we would all agree at first you need that kind of intensity, but then you have to work towards building in a delay and time when the resources wouldn't be required. Does that make sense? And I can, if you want to come up afterwards, I can refer you to some of the research on that. Hanley, Greg Hanley, who's also speaking today, has done some of the research on that. I think there's a new study coming out. I believe Betz is the author, B-E-T-Z, on signaled delays to reinforcement. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
We were talking about the fact that sometimes it's really hard to get all caregivers on the same page. Is there one suggestion that you would have to, when it's extended family who watch the child, if it's, a matter of classroom teachers where there are paras for other kids coming in and out constantly, is there one?
Yeah, the question was about, essentially about procedural integrity and how do you get everybody on the same page when there's multiple caregivers. And some examples might be extended family members who are watching the child, or it might be paraprofessionals who come into the classroom for a brief period of the day. I think a lot of it depends on the severity of the behavior. And again, if it's severe, if people are getting hurt, if the student himself or herself is getting hurt, or if property is being destroyed, I would put that in a category where you probably need to throw a great deal of resources at it. And the way that I think of it is, let's say some typically developing kid all of a sudden starts bashing his head against the wall. People would look at that and say, there's something wrong here. Something has gone wrong. I'm going to take this kid to the hospital. I'm going to do everything it takes to figure it out and fix it. But for some reason in our culture, we've developed this notion, and I think this isn't true of this group. I mean, you're all here because you're concerned about this, but in our culture, it's kind of like, oh, those kids just bang their head against the wall, or those kids hit other people. No, that's behavior that is changeable, and we need to find the resources to fix it. So what I would recommend in cases where there are multiple care providers, that each of those people should be competency trained. And what I mean by that is they don't just sit and receive a lecture about what to do, but they have to demonstrate correct implementation of the procedure, or else they would not be in charge. And that might seem weird to do that with grandmother, but I've seen cases where the treatment is working really well with the family, and then grandmother comes in to babysit on a Friday night, and the kid ends up in the hospital because the treatment falls apart. Grandmother's doing the opposite thing. So I always warn families, we've got this treatment in place, it's working. Who else might take care of your child? Who might be responsible? And they might say Aunt Judy, Grandma, Grandpa, whatever. Then we set up a time to train them. Another approach that people have taken is pyramidal training. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but what that is you kind of identify a point person. So in your work, you might notice this teacher or this para is really good at running the procedure, and you train them to train other people. And it's pyramidal in the sense that then the person responsible for the initial training doesn't have to do that with the dozens of kids he or she may be working with. And then similarly with families, you might notice that mom is especially good at doing this training. And incidentally, and again, in the interest of time, I haven't had time to talk about the whole step-by-step process, and maybe that's something we can do another time as well. But we train siblings. We've trained siblings as young as 7 and 9 years old to implement behavioral procedures. 12-year-olds, it's very common because of that very problem that you've identified, and that is, mom goes to cook dinner or pay the bills or something, and now it's 12-year-old sister with her sibling and doesn't know what to do, then you're just going to get a reversal. Like those little reversals from treatment that I showed, that's what it looks like. The behavior just comes back because the environmental contingencies come back. So, competency-based training, it's basically behavioral skills training that involves first a didactic instruction. So you explain to the person what they're doing and why, because if people don't get the logic of it, then they don't understand. You're probably getting the noise in the back. Can you hear me? Just let me know if you can't hear me. So if they don't understand why they're doing it, it's much less likely they'll do it when you're not there. Then second, role play, which is where you act like the kid and give them feedback about what they do and change roles and so on. Then actual demonstration, where you demonstrate the procedure with the target individual and explain why you're doing it. Then give them feedback as they're doing it until you can get to a point where they're not requiring any corrective feedback. So when I say feedback, I mean corrective feedback, which is like, you were supposed to give her attention right then, and also positive feedback, like, good, you got it right that time. And when you're only giving positive feedback, no more corrective, you start thinning yourself out. But they've demonstrated that they can implement the procedure. That's a really good point, though. Very common issue that we face. Any other questions or comments before we move on? Okay, well, let's move into our discussion of non-contingent reinforcement, which is the antecedent type of intervention that we'll be focusing on for the remainder of the session. For those of you who are not familiar with the procedure, I just want to give you kind of a broad overview of what it is. So we talked about differential reinforcement, where you minimize and maximize. Non-contingent reinforcement is delivered independent of behavior. So in behavior analysis, we call that a fixed time schedule. So for example, if I have learned that you engage in problem behavior because it produces attention, I'm going to give you attention for free on some schedule. And that might be once every 5 minutes or once every 10 minutes. The notion behind it is that if I'm giving you attention for free, you don't have to engage in problem behavior to get my attention. And in fact, if you engage in the problem behavior, you won't get my attention necessarily unless it happens to be on one of those scheduled intervals. So the subject's behavior does not influence the schedule of delivery, and the schedule is thinned from a very rich schedule. In fact, in almost all of my work, although this is not true of everyone doing work in NCR, we start with continuous. So if somebody's behavior is maintained by escape, we give them free escape for the entire school day to start with. And part of this might be a bias because of the type of kids I get called in to work with. So usually by the time they call me, it's some crisis situation and we have to stop the behavior right away. But nonetheless, we start with just continuous and then gradually build up the instructional activity if it's a school-based situation, or thin out the attention according to some schedule. A lot of times when I talk about NCR or non-contingent reinforcement, it's counterintuitive. Especially for those of us in behavior analysis, we kind of have learned that reinforcers should be contingent on something. They should be contingent on some appropriate behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about the context in which we developed NCR procedures and why we evaluate NCR. First, we noticed that there's a lot of basic behavioral research from decades ago showing that response-independent schedules like fixed time, or FT, and variable time, or VT, shows effects on behavior that are similar to extinction. So, for example, in studies with rats in a experimental chamber, a rat will press a lever to produce food. Everybody knows that, right? Now, if you start giving the food for free, so the rat doesn't have to press the lever anymore, the rat stops pressing the lever. That's very similar to extinction. The behavior goes away. So we started to think, well, if that happens with animals, maybe it would happen with humans. If we give them the reinforcer for free, basically they don't have to press the lever. And if pressing the lever is banging their head or biting themselves or hitting other people, they don't have to do that because they're getting it for free. So basic research pointed to this as a treatment. We also noticed, and now when I say we noticed, this is in our work over 20 years ago when we first started to investigate this procedure as an intervention. We also noticed that in applied acquisition research, people were using non-contingent reinforcement as a control to show the effects of reinforcement. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're teaching a child to build things and you're giving food reinforcers or praise or whatever it might be, and they build these things. Then you stop giving the reinforcers contingent on behavior and you give them for free. Guess what they do? They stop building or stop doing whatever it was you were trying to teach them to do. Then you make it contingent on their behavior and the behavior comes back. So we're thinking there's probably nothing magical about acquired skills that make them go away when reinforcement stops. Maybe the same thing would happen with problematic behavior if we're giving the reinforcers for free. And then third, at about the time we were developing this, we had advances in our assessment procedures that allowed us to realize what was reinforcing the behavior, like those functional analysis assessments I showed a little while ago. Once we learned what was maintaining the behavior, we could then present that reinforcer for free. Prior to the development of that methodology, presenting reinforcers for free didn't make much sense because those reinforcers might be different than what was maintaining the behavior. As long as what we're presenting for free is the same reinforcer, like attention or escape or whatever, maintaining behavior, it should result in a decrease in the behavior. Also, there were some potential limitations to differential reinforcement procedures that were being used at the time, and I'm going to talk about those in just a few minutes. But just this may sound more complicated than it really is. I want to go back to the example of if you press the green button and $100 bills fall out or something like that. What if now you're just sitting in your seat and I come up to you and give you a $100 bill and I keep doing that, and I'm doing that at a pace that's faster than what you could get them by pressing the green button. You're not going to keep going up and getting the money from the green button because you're getting them for free. And especially if pressing the green button no longer works, right? If you're not getting the money for pressing the button, you're getting it for free. Well, that's all this treatment is. We're giving the reinforcer for free so the person doesn't have to engage in the problem behavior to get it. And we start out by loading that on. We give them a whole bunch of free reinforcers, eliminate the motivation for the problem behavior, and the typical effect is the behavior goes away almost immediately. Now we have something to work with. We don't have to be scared going and working with the person. We can gradually build them back into the curriculum, etc. And now that we have maybe a couple decades of research on this particular intervention, we know that it is one of the most reliable ways of immediately, or at least almost immediately, suppressing behavior. Okay, so let me talk about some of the commonly used procedures at the time when we were first developing the NCR interventions. One is a procedure known as DRO, that some of you who work in schools and certainly the behavior analysts will probably know what that is. DRO is a procedure that is similar to DRA, like we talked about earlier this morning, but instead of specifically reinforcing some alternative behavior, DRO involves reinforcing the non-occurrence of problematic behavior. So in other words, if you go 5 minutes without aggression, I will present a reinforcer to you. At the time that we were developing the NCR procedures, DRO was the most commonly used intervention. Surveys had shown that pretty conclusively. However, several review papers had also shown that DRO was relatively ineffective, at least at times. It sometimes produced extinction-like behavior. Now, one of the negative side effects of extinction is that sometimes the behavior gets worse before it gets better. So if you've ever experienced something like telling a parent, if the child is throwing a tantrum because they want a candy bar at the store, don't give them the candy bar, that's extinction. The behavior gets really bad before it gets better. Or maybe you've told them, don't go in and provide attention at night, that you have to extinguish that disruptive behavior so they go to sleep, and the behavior gets really bad before it gets better. Well, sometimes what happens when the behavior is getting really bad is the care provider gives in. It's just too aversive to hear that tantrum or that. So you give in and provide the reinforcer. So that makes the procedure ineffective. It can also be very cumbersome to implement. Imagine if you're a parent and I say to you, for every 5 minutes your child doesn't engage in self-injurious behavior, present a reinforcer. What that means is not only do you have to be diligent every 5 minutes, you have to be diligent all the time because you have to see whether or not the behavior occurred. Otherwise, you're going to commit a treatment integrity failure. Or what if you're a teacher and I come in and say, that student over there, every time they go 5 minutes without tapping on their face, give them this reinforcer. Well, that means you're a teacher in a classroom and you have to watch that particular student continuously or else you wouldn't know the behavior was occurring. And then finally, if the DRO interval is too long, essentially what you're recommending is that the person will never get a reinforcer because they're going to sometimes engage in the problem behavior, and if people are doing it correctly, they would continually reset their timer and the person would never get the reinforcer. So there's a lot of problems with DRO, and at that time we thought these possible advantages with NCR might be worth investigating. So our very first study that we did was, actually we started the study in the late 1980s. It was eventually published in 1992. We thought it'd probably be easiest to start with attention-maintained behavior because attention is something you can easily turn on and turn off and present at particular times. And we thought this procedure, we hypothesized it would be effective or else we would have never tried it for all those reasons that I just talked about. The basic research pointed to it, the use of NCR as a control procedure pointed to it, et cetera, et cetera. So we were pretty confident it would work, but we were shocked to find out the extent to which it worked and how markedly the behavior changed as a result of it. The first group of people we tried this with were adult women with various diagnoses of intellectual disabilities. All three of them were women who had been they had been residing in a residential facility for many years. One of them had, I believe, been in this particular facility for almost 3 decades, and they had very long histories of self-injurious behavior. 2 of them wore protective helmets. And one of them had, skin deteriorated on her hand from hand biting and hand mouthing. We conducted a functional analysis, and for all 3 of them, we found the behavior was sensitive to attention. So when we attended to the self-injury, it increased compared to other conditions. And then the very first person for whom we tried this procedure was a woman who I believe was about 42 at the time. And her self-injurious behavior had been occurring at almost once a second. She was constantly banging her head against the wall. And although I don't expect you to be able to see the details of this graph, I just want to kind of show you some highlights from it. In this baseline period, marked here, Brenda received attention contingent on her self-injurious behavior. So we would go up and say things like, "Stop it, you're going to hurt yourself. What are you doing? What's going on? You don't want to do that." And her behavior rates started to resemble what we had been seeing on her living unit, where we saw almost 1 a second. We were up to about 50 per minute here. So she was constantly banging against the wall like that, and she was wearing a helmet. During the NCR procedure, what we did was, at first, just gave her free attention. So we walked up and said, "Oh, I really like your outfit today. Where'd you get that? You know, what do you have for breakfast today? You want to know what I had for breakfast?" And we just sat with her and talked. And I'll never forget the very first session that we did, because she started out engaging in the self-injurious behavior. And then she sort of looked at us like, huh? Because when she paused, she was still getting the attention, and then she just kind of settled in, and we talked to her, and there was no self-injury for the latter half of the session. And then, as you can see, very quickly, the behavior rates went down to 0. Now, this is somebody who had been engaging in this behavior for almost 3 decades. We were shocked. We did not expect that it would be this effective. We eventually thinned out the schedule to delivering her attention once every 5 minutes. So all we had to do is go up and we'd talk to her for about 30 seconds once every 5 minutes. Now, similar to the question that was raised in the back a few minutes ago, we got objections from the staff for these procedures, because they said we can't attend to her once every 5 minutes. And, you know, that is a rich schedule of attention. But we had found in our baseline observations, they were actually attending to her several times per minute. So this procedure actually decreased the amount of time they spent interacting with her. Now, we still worked with them on trying to thin that out even more, but at least at first, the procedure was much easier to implement than what they had been doing previously. And the obvious main effect was that the self-injury had gone away. So this was our first glimpse into the powerful nature of this procedure, and it was just so easy. You don't have to watch what the person's doing in between. You just deliver the reinforcer on the fixed time schedule. At first it was continuous, but eventually, you know, we could go do work and everything, as long as we came back once every 5 minutes and talked to her for 30 seconds. And so that was replicated with 3 people in the original study. Then we started using it clinically on a routine basis. When I moved to LSU in the early 1990s, I had been itching to try this procedure with other functions of behavior. So I knew that the first couple of people that I met with escape behavior, I was going to try giving them non-contingent escape. So you may remember the 2 boys I talked about when I was giving an example of escape maintained behavior. One was Kevin, who was the 17-year-old who would punch himself, and the teachers and paras would put his chair down and give him a timeout. And so he was escaping, walking from point A to point B by engaging in self-injurious behavior. And the other one was Todd, who, or what did we call him in the study? Because these are fictitious names. No, not that was. Those were. Oh, it was Mark. It was Mark in this particular one. But what we did with Mark, or Mark was the guy who, if he started engaging in the problem behavior at the table or desk, you know, he'd bite his hand or bang his head. The teacher would move him away from the table. So what we did during their what we called non-contingent escape treatments, or NCE, was we started to, at first, we gave them no demands. So all Kevin had to do was sit there in his chair, and as you can imagine, he had no self-injurious behavior because there was no motivation to do so. That is indicated by these early sessions in treatment here. And then we gradually increased the time interval that he had to walk, such that at the end he was walking for 10 consecutive minutes before he would get a chance to sit in the chair. Now, noteworthy is we did get at one point what looked like an extinction burst in this particular treatment. So as you thin out the schedule, sometimes you will see that increase in behavior that occurs. Some other research that I'll show in a few minutes suggests that the extinction burst is not as pronounced using NCR procedures as it is if you just used straightforward extinction. So straightforward extinction with him would have been to just require him to walk for 10 minutes without any chance to sit down. Then the non-contingent escape for Mark is over here. What we did is we started out with continuous escape from the work table. Then again, we see what might be a little extinction burst, but then eventually he stops engaging in the self-injurious behavior in the context of the work environment. Yes, question?
Two questions. First, on Mark, what is the second condition you guys?
Okay, yeah, I skipped that because it's kind of outside the context of what we're talking, but this was what we call differential negative reinforcement of other behavior. It's essentially DRO, but we were providing escape contingent on the non-occurrence of behavior. We didn't really do a comparison of the two because this one went first and then this one went second, so there might have been a sequence effect. So that's why I didn't emphasize it here. But nonetheless, it was kind of interesting that immediately you see a more gradual decrease in that treatment condition than you do here, where the first 3 sessions there was no self-injurious behavior, which ultimately leads us to how we apply it now when we want to just kind of slam the behavior down to 0. Yeah.
Do you have any guidelines for maybe a typical problematic behavior, 6.5-hour, classroom school day? How long will that continuous reinforcement, the non-contingent reinforcement, generally go before you start to try and begin fading that, ensure that it's been learned?
Yeah, again, no, I don't have any strict guidelines, but we're going to come back to that and talk about various strategies that have been used. What we typically do, and again, there's probably a bias because of the severity of the type of kids I get called in to work with, but I will study the data on a daily basis, and usually I'll do something like 3 school days in a row with below some criterion level, and then we'll add in periods without the reinforcer. So with escape behavior, we might add in 1 instruction per hour or something like that. With attention maintained behavior, we'll have the teacher's attention diverted for 30 seconds or something like that. But in other cases, we've increased it more rapidly with less severe behavior, but always letting the data guide our decision making on that. If you see an increase in the behavior, you're probably going too fast. Other researchers have used what they call the mean inner response time as a guideline. So mean inner response time is essentially the reciprocal of the rate of behavior. So if you're seeing 2 responses per hour, or let's say 2 responses per minute, the mean inner response time is 30 seconds, meaning on average the behavior is occurring once every 30 seconds. So the reinforcer delivery has to beat that mean inner response time. So you're delivering the reinforcer before the behavior is likely to occur. So those are the 2 main strategies that have been used. Yes? Yeah, well, it's like, okay, again, I point to the severity. If you require heart surgery, you're going to the hospital, whether or not you had an appointment that day. And I look at this behavior as on a parallel with somebody having a heart attack, somebody having a cancer diagnosis. It can be very, very dangerous. And so things have to change. And so, it varies on a case-by-case basis, but you might have to have somebody's lunch brought to them if transitions are part of what's aversive. But in other cases, you can identify specific types of demands. So we've had kids who are fine walking to lunch and eating their lunch, but it's when you do reading or some specific, and that's what you leave out. So you kind of identify what the specific types of aversive demands are, and those are what you leave out, but they might be doing other things. But we have had that, like the case I described a little while ago, we didn't require that kid to do anything at first, and then we gradually built in. And one of the ways that we first built in his instructional activity is we started to let him ask to do stuff, and we were amazed. After a few days of doing nothing, he actually started asking for certain things. And at first, it helped us identify what kinds of instructional activities he didn't mind so much. But then we had to fade in the ones that were part of his IEP, but that he may not have found as pleasurable. Yes? The question was, what kinds of things do we allow them to have access to while they're escaping in the non-contingent conditions? In these experiments, it was nothing. It was just escape, because we wanted to control for the possibility that it was access to positive reinforcement. But in practice, we typically do a preference assessment and allow them to interact with preferred items during the time that escape is occurring. Yes.
When you were thinning the non-contingent escape, when you were starting to thin that, what would you do if a problem behavior occurred?
The question was, when we were thinning the schedule, what would we do when problem behavior occurred? In the early days of this research, we didn't change the schedule at all. It was truly non-contingent, because we just wanted to test whether or not that non-contingency actually suppressed the behavior. I think you're anticipating a potential problem that might occur, and eventually did occur, and I'm going to be talking about that. And it's actually changed the way that we use this procedure in practice. And that problem is that on rare occasion, for some reason, some individuals' behavior is sensitive to accidental reinforcement. And I'm going to talk about why that might be. But essentially, let's say I've thinned out the schedule to where they're getting attention once every 2 minutes. And right when I'm about to give attention, they bop me in the face. If I then give them attention, that might accidentally reinforce the problem behavior. So to kind of spoiler alert, but I'm going to actually talk about what we do now, which is they'll miss that particular delivery of the attention. We call it a momentary DRO, and I'll show the case that kind of quite literally slapped us in the face to recognize that limitation. So we were getting 2 criticisms in our early publications of these studies. One was that some of the reviewers were saying, don't you think you're going to get accidental reinforcement sometimes? And our answer at the time was, well, it seems like we would, but so far we haven't. And in fact, we had done probably a dozen or more of these interventions and had not gotten that accidental reinforcement effect. But another criticism was, if you're reducing their motivation to engage in problem behavior, won't you also be reducing their motivation to engage in appropriate behavior? So one of my former graduate students, Bethany Marcus, set out to explore that possibility, where she gave the individuals 2 ways to access the reinforcer. One was just on the non-contingent schedule, and a second way was she taught them to ask for it, or amend. And what she found was that at the same time we were able to suppress the problem behavior, which is the dark circles, the student acquired the demand, which was to request the reinforcer. She went back to baseline very briefly and then replicated that effect here. So this is a very straightforward experiment. There was just two ways to get the reinforcer, but now we incorporate this into practice all the time. We still get criticism where people say, you know, if you're doing this non-contingent stuff, you're not teaching the person anything. Well, the way it really works, the way this works in practice is this is just one component of a much larger intervention. You're still doing all your teaching and things like that, but according to the schedule in which you're bringing that back into the person's curriculum. So it's not as if all you're doing is giving them escape or attention or something like that. You're still teaching them verbal skills, you're still teaching them academics and so on. So this kind of simple study just showed that's possible to do. Now, with the other criticism that was just raised, by 1996 or so, which was when we were running this application, it got published in 1997, we were starting to get pretty cocky about this procedure because we had not seen any negative side effects, and it was just working over and over and over again. And we ran into this young woman, I think she was 13 or 14 at the time, and she attended a school where we were doing some work, and she walked around with magazines all the time. And her teachers reported that if you take those magazines from her, she'll beat you up. And it's not only a problem because you get beat up, but it's a problem because she's not doing any work. She's just clutching the magazines the whole time. So we did a functional analysis and found that, yes, the aggression, not surprisingly, was maintained by access to the magazines. So she would hit you and then get her magazines, and she was fine. And so as cocky as we were about this procedure, we thought, well, we'll just do non-contingent access to the magazines as a treatment. So what we did, or what we found, was that after a baseline where we saw an increasing trend in her aggression, during this condition, we just gave her free access to the magazines and found no problem. She's good. Went back to a brief baseline, and then here's where we started to thin out the schedule, as your question anticipates. And boom, she starts engaging in extremely high levels of aggression. And the way this looked was, as my graduate student at the time, who was Hank Rohn, who's now a professor in New York, as he would walk up to give her the magazines, she'd hit him in the chops, and he'd give her the magazines because it was the scheduled time to give her the magazines. So again, we were trying to be really clean with this because it was an experiment and make sure that it was truly non-contingent. Well, what happened is, because that the aggression corresponded with the delivery of the magazines, her behavior was maintained. It got so bad that after 3 sessions, we had to stop the intervention. And we implemented what we call now a momentary DRO. And that is, as you were coming up to her, if she engaged in the aggression, she didn't get the magazines for that interval. So it's no longer a non-contingent schedule. It still has all of the ease of application of a non-contingent schedule because you don't care what's going on in the interim. You don't have to watch the person every moment of every day. But at that instant, when you're about to deliver the reinforcer, if the problem behavior occurs, you don't deliver that one. And although we didn't replicate this at the time, you can see that it fairly immediately went down to 0, and we were giving her the magazines once every 5 minutes. And so what this allowed was for her to do work for about like 4.5-minute intervals, and then have access to her magazines, then another work interval, and then magazines, and so on. So that was an astute observation. We did eventually run into that problem, and we've run into it now over the years, I'd say over 10 times. I haven't really kept track. I could probably go back and look, but it's happened enough that we almost never do truly non-contingent anymore. We do this momentary DRO just to avoid the likelihood that it could happen at all. I don't know how well you'll be able to see the next figure, but I wanted to show you, and this study is listed in the readings. Did everybody get the handout for this? You didn't get the handout? Okay, do you know? Oh, it's on the website. Okay, so you can get it on the website. I listed all the references from these studies that we'll be talking about, so you can look at the study more carefully if you'd like. But what this figure shows is the arrows represent where the magazines were returned to her, and this is the cumulative responses. So the pattern was she would stop engaging in the aggression. Then as you approached the time when the magazines were going to be returned to her, she had a flurry of aggression. Then the magazine was returned, another flurry, magazine was returned, another flurry, magazine. So you can see how the accidental reinforcement would occur under these circumstances. So this was session 18, 19, and 20. 20 is the one we had to cut short because it was just literally Hank Roan had a swollen lip from doing this. And so that's when we went to this MDRO and got the treatment effect. But we thought it was interesting how just reliable it was that burst would occur and then the behavior, or then the reinforcer was delivered. The next area of research that we pursued related to this was we were getting asked the question a lot, these effects are very much like extinction. The behavior is no longer producing the reinforcer, so maybe this is just extinction. So we thought, well, let's compare it to extinction, where we do, with one therapist, we'll do a fixed time schedule of reinforcement, and another therapist will just put the behavior on extinction. We had a couple really interesting cases when I was working at the Children's Seashore House where we were able to test this. We always do it in the context where we think this might actually be a good component of this individual's intervention. And this one child that I'll be describing next, his mother had taken him to a physician several times because he was very destructive, self-injurious, and had very loud tantrums. So he would do things like kick holes in the wall at home. He would bite his hand. He would tear up the curtains and things like that. And so these rooms that we had at the Children's Seashore House were like family rooms, like I was describing for Todd. And what we would do is, and I forgot to mention what the physician told her. The physician told her, just ignore the behavior. So when you leave the room and he starts doing that, just shut the door and ignore it. And so she came to us saying, my house is destroyed. I mean, I can't go on with this, so I need something better. And so we thought, well, let's compare the physician's recommendation to an NCR procedure to see if we can get any better effects. This is just one example of what we got. By the way, this kid was 6, but he was really small. He looked like he was around 4. So people couldn't believe how much he could tear up a room, but he could. And this particular slide shows disruptions per minute. What we were calling disruptions included things like kicking holes in the wall, tearing down curtains, throwing pillows off the sofa, and things like that. In baseline, what we did was we had 2 therapists alternate. They were both adult females, because he lived with his mom. We just kind of wanted to make it similar to that. And what they would do in baseline is they'd leave the room, and as soon as the problem behavior occurred, they'd come back in and say, stop doing that, you're ruining the curtains, and give him a lot of attention and things like that, and then he was fine. Then we assigned one of the therapists to be his extinction therapist, and what the extinction therapist did was, like the physician recommended, just stayed out of the room when the tantrum started or the disruption started. And one therapist was the fixed time therapist, and she would come in at set points in time, and in fact there was a timer that he could look at to see when she was coming back. Well, this burst of behavior right here was from the extinction therapist. So you can see that his behavior actually got worse before it got better, and we would have spontaneous recovery of the behavior even towards the end of the treatment. So imagine if you're this kid's mom and the behavior is spiking at 10 disruptive episodes per minute, and I'm not even showing all the other data. He had self-injury, tantrums, other things going on that followed the exact same pattern. Probably what she's going to do is give up somewhere in here, right, and go in. So that's why this wasn't working, and that's why her house was destroyed. Whereas with the fixed time therapist, we didn't see anything very similar. We did have a few spikes as we thinned the schedule, but eventually we were able to thin it out to, I think in the study we thinned it out to 5 minutes, but with his mom we eventually thinned it out to about once every 15 minutes, so she could leave the room, go do other things, start his timer, and come back and give him attention. So in that way, we felt, and we replicated this with him with 3 other forms of behavior and then with 2 other individuals in that particular study, and found the same effects. So if the question is, do I just do straightforward extinction or do I do a non-contingent schedule, probably the non-contingent schedule would be more effective. Now you might throw in here a momentary DRO, where if he happened to be engaging in the behavior when you were about to come back in, then you don't at that point in time. So what have we learned from that history of research on NCR? Really what it boils down to in terms of our practice right now is that we use NCR in crisis situations by completely eliminating the establishing operation for the target behavior. So I say this because you probably can see that if all we talked about today was this non-contingent reinforcement stuff, you might think I'm fully advocating use this procedure, which is why I spent the first half of our talk today talking about differential reinforcement, because that's what I really advocate. Maximizing reinforcement for appropriate, minimizing reinforcement for problem behavior. But we use this in crisis situations. If you notice all those graphs I've shown, and I can assure you they're very representative of what we see in day-to-day practice, it's the one way we know of to really just wipe out behavior immediately. So when somebody calls us in and says, this 13-year-old who weighs 325 pounds is beating up his teacher, and we identify what's maintaining that behavior, we use this. If nothing else, it lets everybody regroup. We have a couple days to say, where are we going with this kid? And how can we do this safely? How can we start to introduce his curriculum? Or as you pointed out, can we identify things that don't set off the behavior where he could continue with the activities that the rest of the class is doing? So that's the circumstance in which we use it. Then as we advance and the procedure has become effective in suppressing the main target behavior, we combine NCR with differential reinforcement so that we're still teaching an alternative way to get attention or to request escape or to complete schoolwork or whatever the alternative behavior might be, so that NCR is not just occurring in a vacuum. It's only one piece of a much larger treatment puzzle for any particular individual. It might be what we start with intensely, but then differential reinforcement is incorporated as soon as possible. And then the third suggestion is to very gradually thin the schedule of reinforcement. And this goes back to the question that was raised earlier about, is there a protocol for how to thin it out? It's very individualized, and you really have to let the data guide you on it. So you just see what happens when you eliminate it, and if you get that effect consistently for a few days or a few hours, depending on how much time you have with this person, then you can start to thin that NCR schedule. But I've seen it go really fast with some people and really slow with other people. And depending on the severity of the behavior, sometimes if we even see one instance of the target behavior, we have to kind of slow down and make sure we're not increasing the schedule too quickly. Yes? That's a really good question. The question was, when we see a spike, do we then sort of reset the schedule of reinforcement and go back? Usually not, because the characteristic effect is that you will sometimes get one of those spikes, and it seems like the behavior is encountering extinction during those times because now the intervals are longer, and so they're, in a sense, realizing for the first time this behavior is not producing attention or escape or whatever. So you get a little burst, and then you just kind of continue with your schedule. Now the caveat for that is if it goes up and it stays up, then we do reset it because it appears that we've gone too fast. There's a little bit of a concern with that we're starting to see, and we haven't done any research on this, but we're planning to try to do this, is we're concerned that some individuals' behavior is very sensitive to what we call molar or larger contingencies. So they might be sensitive to the fact that if I start doing, engaging in the behavior, they're going to make it easier for me tomorrow or something like that. Whether or not that really influences their behavior, it remains to be seen. Yes?
I'm assuming, based on the population that you're working with, you're also having to account for variables such as, sleep or mood or illness and so forth. Did, like the non-contingent, that superseded all of this?
Yeah, I definitely, the question was about given the population that we're working with, other variables must come into play like sleep and mood, and I presume you would add, things that happened to them earlier in the day and stuff like that. Yeah, the assumption is that there would be other variables affecting their behavior, illness, things like that, and that could account for some of the variability that we see. We haven't systematically evaluated that yet. I think there's starting to be some systematic evaluations, at least with sleep, where evaluating whether sleep can interact with things like escape behavior. I think conceptually it makes sense that it would, right? I mean, on a day when we don't get enough sleep and then our supervisor says, please have this report done by the end of the day, it's much more aversive, and we might, say, I got a headache, or can I do it tomorrow, or whatever escape behavior we have in our repertoire, because lack of sleep might add to the aversiveness of the demand. So it makes sense that would happen with these kids, but we haven't evaluated that in a context of the non-contingent escape or non-contingent attention procedures. But it's very likely that some of the variability induced that we see could be a result of other variables. Probably is, because we're controlling the variables within our study. Other questions, comments? Okay, so how does this approach jibe, if you will, with what we were talking about earlier in terms of combining differential reinforcement and non-contingent reinforcement? Well, if you think about the list that I created earlier with the hypothetical example of attention maintained aggressive behavior, there's something I left off of that, and that is what in my field we would call an establishing operation. Like, why is it that the kid is so motivated to get attention to begin with? Well, maybe it's because, as we see at the bottom of this slide, he's getting attention on the average of, let's just say, 30 minutes, variable time 30 minutes in baseline. So there's a very low level of attention for this student in the context of the classroom. And you can really increase that rate by engaging in problem behavior. So it's a new variable to throw in there in your baseline observations. Just how often does this person get attention anyway? And then when you move to your solution or your treatment, you not only want to stack the deck in favor of all these variables we discussed, but you also want to make sure that variable time schedule is much richer than it had been in the baseline context. So by doing this, you're reducing the motivation to engage in problem behavior. Because it's probably the case that non-contingent schedules work for two reasons. One, it's essentially like saying, why engage in problem behavior when you're already getting the reinforcer? You're getting it for free, so why bang your head to get attention if you're already getting attention? And then the second reason is you disrupt that contingency. It's not that the behavior is what produces the reinforcer, but that reinforcer is coming anyway. So by enriching that schedule of non-contingent attention, you're actually enhancing the likelihood that this differential attention would be effective. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, I think we do have some time to go into another application of NCR that we've been exploring. Our first study on this was done with the Picture Exchange Communication System, or PECS. And the first author was one of my former graduate students, Annabelle Gutierrez, who's now a professor at Florida International University in Miami. But what Annabelle did in this study, and what we're currently replicating using the iPad technology, is that we ran across a bunch of kids, as I was saying in the beginning, who seemed to be very fluent with like picture exchange books and would whip through it and find something and either point to it or hand it to a teacher or a parent, and it looked like they were very good. But then when we looked at what was in the book, it was all favorable items. So maybe at some point in learning the PACS, they had learned a discrimination between favorable and not preferred items. But now all that was in there was the favorable items. So we became concerned that they weren't actually telling us what they wanted, but just picking out something, and anything that they gave us was pretty good. And if it wasn't good enough, they might flip and find something else. So what Annabelle did was he decided to arrange it such that to begin with, they had a choice between asking for two items. That one item was something they already had, and one item was something that was across the table that they didn't have. All right, so the way this relates to NCR is they were non-contingently receiving the item, which should reduce their motivation to ask for that item. So we started to use it as a test to see whether or not the person had actually learned the discrimination between the two PECS cards. Here is a short video of kind of how that looks. So for this little guy, his two most preferred toys, according to a preference assessment that we did, what were these little animals and puzzles. Actually, this guy, this is from about 5 years ago, and we still work with this guy, so it's fun for me to see him back then. But this was just a session where he had the animals for free, and if he wanted the puzzle, he had to ask for it with the picture exchange cards.
Good job. Puzzle, good.
So that was just one trial where we would then score yes or no. He asked for the one he didn't have. And what the data outcomes look like are this. So in these examples, we have 4 individuals who had what we call the establishing operation present. That means they didn't have that particular item, or the establishing operation absent. That is, they already had it. So in this case, for this particular individual, he correctly asked for the one that he didn't have. So this tells us that the discrimination was in fact in place, if that makes sense. So he would only ask for the item that he didn't have. If he started asking for the item that he already had, it would tell us he wasn't really discriminating between the two picture cards. The same was true for this individual. Oh, excuse me, this is the same individual. Mario, this is for drink and for radio. So in one session, he would already have the drink, but he wouldn't have the radio, so he had to ask for the radio. Then we'd flip it in the other sessions. So whichever one he didn't have is what he would ask for. And then this individual is Will, and we see the same thing for cookie and radio. So he would only ask for the one that he didn't have. So essentially, these two guys passed the discrimination test. All right, the NCR procedure allowed us to evaluate whether they would pass that test, and they did. This third individual, Malcolm, also passed the test, but with more variability, and this is for TV and chips. And then, interestingly, Millie, the fourth person, failed the test. She just randomly would ask for one of the items or the other. And interestingly, in terms of where these individuals were before the study, she was the one who seemingly had the most sophisticated use of the picture exchange system. She had a book and she would leaf through it and pull things out. But what these data suggest is that she was not discriminating between the cards at all. She was just, the behavior that had been reinforced is handing somebody a card without looking at them. So she required more training in this particular area. Okay, we have about 15 minutes or so for questions, comments, thoughts about any of this. Does anyone have any? Yes.
Do you ever have situations where the problematic behavior involves obtaining something that the parents or teachers say absolutely we can't let them have it? Maybe it's for a health purpose. The child's going after something that involves food allergy or there's a type of, or just for some reason maybe the object is dangerous. That what we want to give as a free reinforcer actually can't be the option.
That's a really good question. I'll repeat it for those on the webcast. The question was about what if the reinforcer maintaining the problem behavior is something that the person can't have or shouldn't have anyway. So examples might be a food allergy, or it might be playing with something that's too dangerous, or things along those lines. The issue is equally relevant to differential reinforcement as it is to non-contingent reinforcement, because with differential reinforcement you're teaching an alternative way to request that item, and if it's something that they're not supposed to have, then you really can't teach that. So the approach we've taken, and I've seen some others do something similar in the literature, is to try to identify functional replacements. And even though that might not be always possible, if you take the most highly preferred other item and make sure that they obtain that reliably through appropriate behavior, then minimize the likelihood of accessing it through the target stimulus through problem behavior, then you still probably will win out, right? So no matter how much problem behavior you engage in, you're still not going to get to stick your finger in the light socket, for example. But you can maybe, play with a radio or something like that. That might be preferred, not as preferred as the light socket, but at least you can teach the appropriate response to obtain that. So then translating that to non-contingent reinforcement, you would give non-contingent access to probably a variety of similar, functionally similar, highly preferred items, but just restrict access for safety reasons to the other items. But that comes up quite a bit, yeah.
If you are in an NCR schedule and you get an extinction burst, about how many data points before you would change the schedule?
Well, I think it depends on if a couple things. If the extinction burst naturally produced access to the reinforcer, so in other words, let's say it's attention maintained behavior, and you get this flurry of behavior, and the teachers or parents have to attend to the behavior to such an extent that they're probably maintaining it, I would probably change that almost immediately. It also depends on how long my observation window is. So if I'm doing like 10-minute snapshots of behavior, I might want to see several examples of that before I would make any changes. However, if it's a whole day and you're going on with aggression for a whole day, I would probably go back immediately. I wish there were better rules of thumb or heuristics, and that's something that we probably need to explore more in future research. But to date have found it to be so individualized that the only recommendation I can really make with confidence is to study your individual data as carefully as you can and make decisions based on what you're seeing, because it is so different with different people. Yes?
You've shown a lot of the NCR with the attention and esteem. Is there ever trouble when you try to do tangibles and that when you're then at the end and have to take it back with that
Good point. Let me repeat the question. A lot of my examples were with non-contingent attention and non-contingent escape. And is there ever a problem with tangible items when you have to remove it? A good example of that was the young woman who had the magazines, and yeah, it was a problem when you pull the. First of all, trying to pry them apart from her was a difficulty, and then, as I mentioned, when you were about to give them back, she would engage in aggression. So yeah, that is a potential problem, because a distinction between the two is with attention and escape. Those can just be delivered independent of any kind of physical exchange with the individual. But when you have tangible items, if they're clutching them, then you have to kind of pry them out of their hands. I think it'd be interesting to sort of compare non-contingent schedules for behavior maintained by tangible items to non-contingent schedules for behavior maintained by those others. And I think your hunch is probably correct, that it's less likely to be effective in those cases because of the struggle. It's interesting, even with preference assessments. One of my graduate students once went to conduct a stimulus preference assessment with a kid who you would think, oh, that's going to be a pleasant thing because the child's getting lots of reinforcers and things like that. The principal ended up asking her to leave the school because the kid was screaming so loud every time she tried to pull away one of the tangible items. And in fact, we followed that up with a study comparing preference assessments where they can just freely access whatever they want versus when we control, like pull it away versus give it, and found far fewer problem behaviors when we just gave them free reign of it. So although I don't have any solid data to support what you're saying, I think the few examples we have do support that it would be much more difficult with tangible items than with attention and escape. Yes?
If you're using a momentary DRO for behaviors that are maintained by escape, hold them at the table, like how would you?
Yeah, that's another good point. With the momentary DRO approach, well, the question was, if you're using the momentary DRO approach for escape behavior, to treat escape behavior, what do you do? Do you hold them at the table, that sort of thing? And that, of course, then has all the same difficulties as escape extinction because that does have an extinction component. Unfortunately, yes, that's what you have to do. And to be honest with you, what we've done in most of the cases when we thought that was going to be a problem is we tried the procedure without the momentary DRO component. So we want to see, can we suppress it with just non-contingent escape? True, we might inadvertently reinforce the behavior sometimes, but our cumulative data show that most of the time that won't happen. So it's probably safe to just go with non-contingent escape. If you do have to include a momentary DRO component, then yeah, you're going to run into that struggle. But at least it's not as prolonged as it would be with, say, escape extinction or something like that. Yes?
Any reactions from other classmates in the room when procedures are being implemented?
That's another good question. The question was, do we see any reaction from other classmates in the room when these procedures are being implemented? I have a range of responses for that. We have had some cases where we actually had to set up a classroom for that particular individual and then sort of fade them back into a regular classroom environment. So in those cases, obviously no, because nobody is really seeing it. And then they may say something like, why is Jim only coming in the mornings or something? And we'll usually explain there's some, he's getting some kind of service where he needs to be away or something like that. And then, ranging all the way up to where we've implemented it in the classroom and nobody seems to say anything or do anything about it. And, one hypothesis we've had is that the behavior might be so disturbing and disruptive to the other students that to have it eliminated is kind of like, we don't care what you did, but just go with that, but again, we haven't systematically evaluated that. But it suggests to me an interesting thing to do might be to have the treatment in place at some points in the day and not in place in the other points of the day, and then let other students select what they would want to be in place. My hunch is they're going to say, have it in place. So even though they might not get to be on the computer like John is, at least John's not pulling their hair or turning their desk over and stuff like that. It's an interesting perspective. Also, I think another one that would be interesting would be to evaluate parents' and teachers' preference for using the procedure. Hanley, who I mentioned is here, I think he's presenting this afternoon on sleep, did some studies early on where he compared the individual's preference for non-contingent schedules versus DRA, and he found that they actually preferred the DRA, which makes sense to me because in the DRA they can control when they get the reinforcer, whereas with the non-contingent schedule it's time-based. Other questions? Yes.
How would you handle I guess I would say, insatiable need for attention? Like I have a student who I can give one person to him all day, but then if he sees someone else in the room, he's got to have that person too, and that person, and this student's attention, and that student's attention, and anybody he sees, he's got to have that. And then even while giving constant attention, if he goes to three, so if he goes to put something in his mouth or something that he can't allow him to for safety reasons, the no will then also trigger the behavior.
So the question was about particular individuals who seem to have an insatiable appetite, if you will, for attention. So a new adult comes into the room and they want that person's attention, and then somebody else comes in the room and they want that person's attention. Given the fact that the person is, the child is 3 in your example, there are some really nice studies. It seems like I'm giving Hanley a lot of plugs, but he's one of the top researchers in this area. He has done some really nice research on delay to reinforcement for preschool age kids, including kids with autism and typically developing kids. I would take a look at that approach, but what it involves is very systematically teaching them that attention is not always available, and it involves that procedure where you have a signal that means right now nothing you do will produce attention, but when this one, you get all the attention you want as long as you ask for it appropriately. So it's probably not foolproof at that age, but what a good time to start teaching the kid that concept that adults aren't always going to be available. Other questions, comments? Let's see how we're doing on time. What is it? Okay, I think we just have a few minutes left, and you needed to provide a number or something. So, thanks everyone for attending, and your comments really do give me some ideas for future research. So hopefully we can reconvene in about 10 years and see where those studies go.
Thank you so much. And the code for today is M as in mother, A as in apple, W as in water, 1, 2, 4. MAW 1, 2, 4. Me or him? Oh, okay.